It's always interesting question that follow up, and we're going to, God willing, with Hashem's help, learn a very interesting debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, and it's going to take us to a good part into the top of the next page. So we're going to finish the bottom half of Gimel Amud Aleph, Gimel A, and we're going to go into Gimel B about halfway down on the page. So we're going to do about Amud today. Now, it's a very interesting machlekes because I want to, so first of all, two very great scholars, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Shmuel, are two very famous. Rabbi Shmuel was a very famous Kohen Gadol. It's one of the most famous Kohen Gadol's. And they described the splendor and the majesty would be there when Rabbi Shmuel would go into the Holy of Holies. And Rabbi Akiva was also very famous because Rabbi Akiva was about Tshuva, was a guy who didn't learn Torah until he was 40 years old and totally changed his life around from the time of 40 years old. So according to the class I heard on That's What Happens When You Learn with a good Chabad teacher, Rabbi Zions, he mixes in a little bit the background. And let me actually share it now. I found it very fascinating. He says that Rabbi Akiva was about Tshuva, and about Tshuva, a guy who returns can go higher than a tzaddik. And Rabbi Akiva will do, based on his personality, will learn every single letter and every single word in Torah is important. He's passionate about Judaism, and there's no such thing, according to his opinion, there's no such thing about symmetric, that the Torah will write something because it's symmetrical. Rabbi Shmuel will say, his opinion will be that it's possible for the Torah to simply say a word in order to have nice poet, like God forbid, I don't know to call it poetry, but that it to be symmetrical, the Torah will write a word. And Rabbi Akiva will argue and say, no, every single word, every single letter. It's famous that when Rabbi Akiva asked Hashem, why are there crowns? Like we have in the mezuzah in the Torah, why are there crowns? He says, because there will be Hashem told Moshe, asked Hashem told Moshe, there'll be a Jew, his name is Rabbi Akiva, who will learn halachas on all the crowns of the letters. So Rabbi Akiva studied every single crown, every single letter. And the debate today, fascinating debate today, will be in how to study three cases, clearly reflecting this debate between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel through the Torah, three random cases that are not connected to each other, but they're not random because they come back to a debate. And why do they argue? It's fascinating because a lot of times in the Talmud, we don't learn why they're arguing. We just learn that they are arguing. But here they're going to show you that based on their methodology of studying Torah, that Rabbi Akiva learns, will say there is no such a thing as symmetric learning, that the way the poetry, the way that it's fitting, there's no such thing, every letter is important. Rabbi Shmuel says no, and it makes a lot of sense to say that the Torah is saying those words because that fits into the context. There will be explanation for three of the debates between these two amazing scholars, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. So it's fascinating. So what we're going to do today is based on the thing we learned last week. What did we learn last week about? Is the husband, when the Torah says to the husband, "V'kinas ishtoi," he should warn his wife. Is that we had an interesting debate last week. Is the Torah saying he should warn his wife? Does it mean, according to Rabbi Shmuel, that it's not telling you should? It's telling you it's okay to warn your wife. And that's what Rabbi Shmuel says, and Rabbi Akiva says, no. It's telling you have to warn your wife. It's a chayva or a permission, or it's an obligation. When the Torah says warn your wife, is it a permission or an obligation? But the husband warning his wife, and we're going to say it's a debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva, and we're going to say, why are they arguing if it's permission? Why? Why are they arguing? Why does one say it's permission and one say it's an obligation? Oh, they're arguing because there's an extra word. And Rabbi Akiva will say that extra word is telling me it's an obligation that you must warn your wife. And Rabbi Shmuel will say, no, not an extra word, it's just symmetric, and therefore just telling you that you're allowed to. And then we're going to have a same debate in a completely different case. In a case of it was very interesting. Now, we just had the funeral, right? And you'll notice that I actually felt a little bad because I went out with Tani to the Kohen, to the room. You had to go to the bathroom. And if you notice, I ran out. Felt really bad because I opened the door and people weren't running out because it was the Kohen. In the Kohen's not allowed to be, if you're not related, you're not allowed to be next to the dead body. So they have a room there, which not thinking he was running to the bathroom, there's a room there that is actually made for Kohanim. It's a window. That's why in Bloomfield Cooper they have a window there because Kohen's not allowed to be there. But the Torah says you're allowed to be, if it's your relative, one of the 7 close relatives, a mother, a father, the Kohen's allowed to go to the funeral. By the way, after they bury relative Kohanim at the border of the cemetery, so the Kohanim can go visit the relatives without going actually into the cemetery. But the Torah says the Kohen's allowed to go to the funeral of one of those 7 immediate relatives, father, mother, sister, brother. And then again, it'll be the same debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. Shmuel say he's allowed to go to the funeral. Rabbi Kiva says, no, the Torah says to go, you have to go to the funeral. Same debate that they're arguing will apply to, does the Kohen have to go to his relative's funeral, or is he allowed to go to his relative? Same debate in a different case. And then a third very interesting case, which we'll see this by, the Torah says that a Jewish servant, you're not allowed to hold them forever. After 7 years, right, the sabbatical year, you have to let them go. But a non-Jewish servant, you should hold them. So does the should hold them mean you have to hold them? According to Rabbi Kiva, it means you're not allowed to give them up. Once you have them as a slave, you're never allowed to let them go. According to Rabbi Yishmael, it means no, it's permission and allowing you to have them. So we're going to. It's fascinating. Gemara showing you how they're at least that they are consistent. That Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva are consistent with their methodology of learning Torah, and based on that, they will argue if something is a Torah is coming to give you permission or the Torah is coming to obligate you. I find it as a fascinating new piece of Gemara which we're going to study together today. But to do that, let us study the verses. If you want, why don't we go to the cases? I'll actually show you the psukim of what I just mentioned to you, which we can see on the WhatsApp. I'll be able to. It's on the WhatsApp, and you can see it here with us together. Let me see if I can get to it. I go back to the beginning. Okay, this is from last week. Okay, so the Torah says here is about the verse in the Torah about keeping the servants. It says, "V'isnachaltem oisam." You may keep them as a possession. The v'neichem acharechem, for your children after you. The reshes achuza la'olam, for them to inherit as a property for all time. So give the servants, the non-Jewish servants, they, as was done in those days, that's what everybody did. But the non-Jewish servants, you can also do like the rest of the world and allow them to move along to your children as a inherited possession. But to your brothers, the Jewish people, do not rule him ruthlessly over him. Do not allow him to be in Everland. He's not considered your possession. He's a worker, and therefore it cannot be transferred from father to son. It does not continue to walk along in that way. So that's a debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva, as I mentioned. If it's saying you're allowed to, a non-Jewish slave, you're allowed to pass him to your son, or is it saying you have to, you're not allowed to let them go? Again, the same debate regarding relatives. The next verse says your sister who's a virgin, who was not to a man. So your sister, if she's married already to another guy, then you're not allowed to go to her funeral. But if it's your sister who has not yet been married to another guy, he should defile himself for her, even though he's a kohen, he should defile himself for her. So does it mean he has to defile himself for her, or does it mean he's allowed to? And then we have the verse from today's, from our past Chumash, that a fit of jealousy comes over him. And he warns his wife. And she became impure. Or a thought to warn her came over him. She didn't become impure, right? We said we don't know what happened, either it did or it didn't. The bottom line is it says it came over to him and he warned her. Does it say he has to warn her, or does it mean that he's allowed to warn her? And that's going to be our subject for today's piece of Talmud. So let's go inside to today's fascinating Gemara. Here we go. Okay. Gufa means in the topic alone, which means Gufa means let's study something we just discussed. So you threw it out, you mentioned it. The debate is it permission to warn or you have to warn. Gufa, let's go to that topic itself. Gufa, let's go into the body of the topic and study it. The kines ishtoi. You said that it says the words in the Torah, Vikine es ishto, he warned his wife. And Rishus, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel says that it means it's giving you permission that you are allowed to warn your wife. That it's permission. The Torah is giving you a license, allowing you to warn your wife that if you start sensing some kind of a unholy feelings, you're uncomfortable and you're scared and concerned, you start sensing that maybe your wife is not being faithful. So Rabbi Shmuel says, the Torah is saying, we're giving you permission and allowing you that you can warn your wife. Rabbi Kiva Omer, and the other scholar who's debating Rabbi Shmuel, the famous scholar Rabbi Kiva, he says, Chayva, it's an obligation. Torah says, you must warn her. But Torah says, warn your wife. That's the meaning of the words, that you have to warn your wife. You see that she's doing something unhealthy and not correct. So you must, an obligation to get your cards straight, get your house in order, make sure your wife is behaving as she should. The Torah is telling you it's an obligation to do it. That's one case. Next case, the Gemara says, Lo yitamim. It says to her, you should become tamei. You should become impure. You shouldn't purify yourself, as the verse is talking about, to that sister who's a virgin sister, and to all your relatives. You should become impure. Rishus. Rabbi Shmuel, the school of Rabbi Shmuel says, the words of Rabbi Shmuel says, Rishus, that you have permission to go to your virgin sister's funeral. Rabbi Kiva Omer, and the scholar Rabbi Kiva says, Chayva. It's an obligation. The Torah tells you go to her funeral. You go to her funeral. It's not an option. The Torah is commanding you. Is the right way to read it. Finally, the third case that we're going to discuss today. The Torah says, forever with them, they should serve you. That when you go to Israel, right, and you're conquering the land, you should make them your slaves and keep them forever as your inheritance. So Rishus and Rabbi Shmuel said, Torah is telling you, you have permission to acquire slaves from the land of Israel or from the nations of the world, from the non-Jews. You have permission and allowance to keep them, and it becomes part of your property, and then you transfer them, as was the custom in those days, to have slaves, and you pass them from father to son. Rabbi Kiva Omer, and Rabbi Kiva says, Chayva, it's an obligation. The Torah is telling you, keep them as slaves. You keep them as slaves, and you don't have permission to allow, you're violating a prohibition of the Torah if you are actually going to let them go. Very interesting. So that's the three cases. So Reb Papa asks a simple, obvious question to Rabbi Shmuel. He says a simple, obvious question. He says to Rabbi Shmuel, Amar le Rav Papa lab to Abaya. He says, Rav Papa, the scholar Rav Papa, says to Abaya, another famous scholar called Abaya. He says, V'amrila Rav Misharshi al Rav. And some people say it was another scholar, Rav Misharshi asked Rav. But we're not. There's two opinions about who was it that asked who. Was it Rav Papa, a famous scholar? You'll get used to the names as we learn. Scholar called Rav Papa who asked this to Abaya, or scholar Rav Misharshi who asked this to Rava. Leimer Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Kiva. Shall we say? At this debate, you're telling me there's three cases, right? With a Kohen contaminating to his sister, with keeping servants. You're telling me three cases, and with warning one's wife. Lema, why don't we say, it seems that what you're saying is not just those three cases. Should we say that Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva, the debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva is B'chol Torah Kula. In the whole Torah, Hachi Pligi, are arguing in this. Maybe these two rabbis just arguing all the 613 mitzvahs, all at least the positive mitzvahs, the 248 positive mitzvahs. The Mar, that Mar means this one master, this guy, one of them, Omar, says, Rishus, that everything the Torah says is permission. And Mar, Omar Chayva, and one says it's an obligation. So in other words, whoa, what are you guys saying? Is this, because they're going to come to I already gave you the information that they're debating is extra words, an obligation or not, but before we knew that, you just hear the three rabbis are arguing in these three cases. You say, whoa, hold your horses. Maybe the whole Torah. And what's funny here is that something very not good will come out. You know what will come out not good from this? Is that, could you say that all mitzvahs of the Torah are really suggestions according to Rabbi Shmuel? Is that what you were thinking? Whoa! Rabbi Shmuel is saying that every time the Torah says something, it's just giving you a suggestion. Rabbi Zion's class was very funny. He's like, there's some Jews who believe that when the Torah says, put on tefillin, it's a suggestion, it's not really a commandment. We want to make for you a suggestion that if you're up to it, we recommend you putting on tefillin. Is that what Rabbi Shmuel, is this the debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva? Rabbi Kiva is saying, listen, every time the God says to do something, you got to do it. And Rabbi Shmuel says, no, there's simply 613 recommendations and suggestions that we're allowing you to do the mitzvahs, the 248 positive commandments, are we allowing you to do the mitzvahs? Is this what's going on over here? And that's what's bothering the Gemara right away. It's like, whoa, how can you say that this is the good debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva? Is this really the debate? Maybe it's in all the mitzvahs. So he says, no, calm down. Amarle, he says, does it calm down? They're arguing in verses. It's simply, if you study the verses, it's not a standard argument that everywhere the Torah says that you should do something, and we're going to argue if it means you have to or you're allowed to do it. It's specifically here that they're arguing in these, based on the verses, is going to lead us to all of a sudden in these three cases that Rabbi Shmuel will say they're allowing you to do it and not saying you have to do it. And why? Why is it that these three cases are allowing you to do it? And you'll understand right away. We're going to get into it, and you're going to see right away why Rabbi Shmuel over here. Let's take the first case of our case that our Gemara is starting with one warning his wife. Why is it telling you that you're allowing you, giving you license for one to warn the wife and not saying that you have to? Even though Torah says warn your wife, it means allowing in these specific cases. So Vikinas Ishtay, let's get into it right now and to see the first case. Vikinas Ishtay, the Torah says one should warn his wife. The Shus is permission to Rabbi Shmuel, the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Kiva says chayva, it's an obligation, right? That's the debate, same words. My taima, the Rabbi Shmuel, the mem test stands for my taima. My taima means what is the reason? Rabbi Shmuel, why does Rabbi Shmuel think that this would be why does Rabbi Shmuel think that this is allowing you to warn her? So he says, I'll explain to you a very simple reason. Savar law, he holds, kihai tana, like this other tana, like there's another discussion elsewhere. A tana is the author who wrote the Mishnah and the Brisa, right? The Mishnah and the Brisa is like a Brisa. The Tanya that we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Omer, there's a Brisa. Brisa is the original postings, right? The notes that they wrote of the oral tradition. They wrote Mishnahs, and then they wrote Brisas, were the extra ones that were left over. That this rabbi, they say the name of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Yaakov, that klape, it means facing because of, Sha'amra Torah, the Torah says, it's a violation of the 365 prohibitions. One of them is you're not allowed to hate your brother in your heart. You're not allowed to hate another Jew. It's prohibition. You're violating the Torah by hating another Jew in your heart. Like Torah says you're not allowed to hate your brother in your heart. Always, it's funny a lot of times because a lot of times people will be very nice to people in the street, but they won't be nice to their family members. So you'll think, oh, loving my fellow as, but you should know, loving your fellow as yourself goes on your wife and kids too. It goes on it also goes, just like you're obligated to love the guy across the street. You have to be nice to your friend. The other guy across the street, you also have to be nice to your children and your wife. So you might think, I might assume that it would be a violation to warn a husband to warn his wife, because first of all, you can imagine the fighting the husband and the wife are going to have. And you could also imagine, remember we said also between her and her friends, you're going to cause tremendous animosity. So based on the verse that says, like, Torah says a prohibition, you're not allowed to hate another Jew, which means you're not allowed to hate your wife. You can't cause hatred between you and your wife and her friends. I would have thought like this case where the husband warns his wife. So Talmud Leimer, so the Torah says, that if a sense of dread, like he's getting afraid of his wife, that she's something happening, that he senses that something wrong, and he warns his wife, and he's telling you it's okay. You're not in violation of one of the 630 commandments of that you're not allowed to cause hatred and fighting between another Jew. I would think you're not allowed to warn your wife. So I have grounds to say this is prohibited. So the Torah is telling you you're allowed. So you get it. If there wouldn't be any prohibition telling you you're not allowed to do this, then the verse would then automatically be coming to say that you have to do it. But because there's a verse that tells us this is prohibited, the next verse is coming to tell you not that you have to, but it's not prohibited. It's coming to allow something that maybe under normal circumstances would be prohibited. In this scenario, it's okay to create something with Lysisna, even though it might definitely can make problems, could cause hatred. If you're sensing, the Torah was also worried, though, on the other hand, that about a woman acting promiscuously. So Torah said over here, because we're worried about her acting promiscuously, we're going to allow you to warn her because we want to make sure that she's not doing anything with another man. So the Torah is the Torah is allowing you to do this.
You call me?
Yeah. Okay, let's go on. Okay, let's go further. So now we understand Rabbi Shmuel very well. Okay, get it. Rabbi Shmuel, usually if God says to do something, you got to do it. But in a case where there's a prohibition there, you think you're not allowed to, the Torah in that case is telling you that it's okay to do it, but not telling you you have to do it. So Rabbi Shmuel makes a lot of sense, but now we have to understand Rabbi Akiva's point of view. Rabbi Akiva, the Torah has to come to tell us that it's allowed. How do you know that the Torah? How do you know the Torah is telling you that the husband must? It's a chayv, an obligation for him to warn his wife. The verse could just be telling you that it's okay for a husband to warn his wife, not telling him he's obligated to do it. Rabbi Akiva, what's Rabbi Akiva going to do? How is he? What is his opinion? You're telling me they're arguing in the verses. Like, what are they arguing in? Well, he says, if you really look at the verse, if you remember, the verse was very repetitive. Remember, it says he warns his wife and she did do it, or he warned his wife and she didn't do it. It was very superfluous. It was like doubling the language. So Rabbi Akiva kinui achrina ksiv, he says that's the answer. There's another time it says the word kinui. It says the word kinui twice. The warning that the husband gives the wife, it says it twice. So the first time it says the word that the husband warns his wife. Why did it say it? It's coming to tell me that it's allowed. You're allowed to warn your wife. And even though there's a violation of hating another Jew, the Torah said you're allowed to. But then the Torah says it again. Why does the Torah say it again? The Torah says that the husband warned his wife a second time to tell us that he has to warn his wife. So he's telling you, had it only said one time that a husband warned his wife, that would just come to tell me that he's allowed to warn his wife. But the Torah says then a second time again that he warned his wife. And from there we learn that not just is he allowed to warn his wife, but he has to warn his wife. Okay, so if you remember, we had the verse. I could go back to it in the WhatsApp. I believe I have it over here. If you remember, we've been studying this for the past 2 weeks. So I think you guys are already somewhat familiar with it. The first one, but a fit of jealousy comes over him, and he warns his wife. He wrote up about his wife, who has defiled himself. Or if a fit of jealousy comes over him, and again he wrote his wife, he warns his wife. So the Torah is very superfluous in saying he warned his wife. So Rabbi Akiva says that's exactly why the Torah is repeating itself, because it was a necessity to tell me that A, he's allowed to warn his wife, and B, he must warn his wife. And that's why the Torah is repeating itself 2 times to tell me warning twice, to tell me not just are you allowed to warn your wife, but that you have to, the man also has to warn his wife. So very interesting. So now we got to go back to Rabbi Shmuel. Now we got a problem. Rabbi Akiva says it says twice the word kinu. Rabbi Shmuel said it only said it once, and that once was giving me a license that I should be allowed to warn my wife. But now it says twice. Why doesn't Rabbi Shmuel learn that from the 2 times that A, you're allowed to, and B, or even have to? Rabbi Shmuel answers what I told you. Since the Torah anyway has to come and tell us that, well, we're not sure what happened here. So either she didn't become impure or she didn't become impure. That she did defile herself or she didn't defile herself, which means the Torah is trying to tell us that she cannot be with her husband, even though we're not sure, even though we don't know anything happened and she has to separate herself from her husband, even though we don't know whether she did or she didn't, right? So it had to go back and forth. That told me both options. The boy the misni v'hi nitma. So ksiv nami, so it already wrote v'kines ishtay a second time, that he, in both scenarios, the first case where she did defile herself, it says that he warned her, and in the second option where she didn't defile herself, it also says that he warned her. And so really, the Torah had to use both options in the verse, but she did defile or she didn't defile, to tell you that we don't know what happened here. But it didn't have to really say twice that he warned her and she did defile, and he warned her and she didn't defile. It could have just said he warned her and she did or didn't defile. But because we want to follow symmetric, we want it to match. And since you started off saying he warned her and she defiled herself, we're going to make it symmetric and already say that he warned her and she didn't defile herself. So the reason it says twice warning is because just for the flowing, the poetic consistency, the symmetric, and therefore, because it says the word kine twice, Rabbi Shmuel says, I don't think that everything is to be learned from, and therefore I'm going to let it go. I don't think that's telling me that he has to warn her. I think that's just consistency. That's just to make it symmetric. Rabbi Akiva says, no, we learn every single letter. And therefore, if it said it, it's something to be learned. And what I'm going to learn from that extra word that it didn't have to say is that he has to, it's a chayv, it's an obligation for the husband to warn his wife. Let's look inside. The Tanya, Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, like we study from the sayings of Rabbi Shmuel, the Tanya Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, that we learn from Rabbi Shmuel, called Parsha, any Torah portion, any saying, any line, any word, Shenemra Vinishnis, that it says itself and then it repeats itself. Repeats what it just said earlier to later, right after. It's not being repeated, Ella only, but for the thing that it came originally in order to, the novelty that it came to teach us. Therefore, it came to teach us over here the original idea that it was okay for a husband to warn his wife, even though the Torah says it's prohibited to make a fight between people. You shouldn't bring hatred between people. You shouldn't have hatred in your heart. So it's repeating itself to give you the both scenarios here that it could be it did happen, it could be it didn't happen, but it's not coming to teach you a new novelty. And as we said, Rabbi Akiva would say, no, I don't agree. Everything is coming to teach us something, every word, and we can't use that idea of symmetric over there. And that is the end of the first debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. And it's very interesting. We're going to repeat the same idea in the next two cases. Let us go on to where a kohen is allowed to become defiled for his sister's funeral. Let's go on to the next case.
Levi, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah. Is it clear so far? Is it pretty clear?
It's very clear. You do an excellent job. Which my one question is, do we come to a maskana? Which way is the halacha, or we're just moving on?
Let's talk about it after. We're just moving on now. We're just trying to show you that this topic is a fascinating debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva. I don't want to say anything here because I'm recording, but ask me that question as soon as we're done. Okay, and then we will we'll touch upon it. Okay. Zakti Gemara, in case I become famous one day and everyone's watching my classes. I'm just kidding. I don't want to say anything that I'm not. Okay, let's talk about it after. Zakti Gemara. Where do we see this by? Where do we see this by the next case? By a husband, a man who wants to go to his sister's funeral and he's a kohen. Let's see inside. La Yitama. The Torah says, defile yourself to her. To your virgin sister, the Torah says, defile yourself to her. Rishus,
not to her.
For her, defile yourself. Okay. Rishus, Divrei Rabbi Shmuel, this is telling you that you're allowed to defile yourself for her. These are the words of scholar Rabbi Shmuel. We're telling you it's okay for you to defile yourself for her. Rabbi Akiva says it's an obligation. My time, the same question. What is the reason Rabbi Shmuel? Rabbi Shmuel says if the Torah says to do it, to defile yourself for her, why are you saying, why does Rabbi Shmuel say it's just telling you that it's okay to defile yourself for her? He says, well, that's pretty obvious. Since it says in the Torah, Emor el HaKohanim, we're quoting another verse now. Say to the Kohanim, B'nai Aaron, the Kohanim who are the sons of Aaron, V'amarta aleim, and say to them, L'nefesh lo yitama ba'amov, they should not defile themselves for a soul. They shouldn't go to funerals. It says clearly in the Torah that a kohen is holy to Hashem, has to have a certain level of holiness because he's a kohen, and he cannot defile himself for people in the nation, for people. So of course, I would think again, same idea. He's not allowed to, right? Before we said he's not allowed to because it says don't hate another Jew in your heart, your brother in your heart. Here it says don't defile yourself. So itzrich lemichtav. So that's why he needs to write la yitama, defile yourself for her. For her, you should defile yourself. So therefore, the Torah's not telling you you have to defile yourself for her. Hashem said already in another verse in the Torah that Kohanim are not allowed to defile themselves to other people. So comes this verse and says la yitama, for her you're allowed to. For letting you that it's okay. I know you're not allowed to make yourself impure, but it's an immediate relative. It's a girl that's not your sister, that's not even married, and therefore I'm allowing you to go to her funeral. You don't have to sit in the kohen box. You could go to the actual funeral and defile yourself. Rabbi Akiva, so that makes a lot of sense that the Torah will tell us that you're allowed to defile yourself. We're not telling you have to go to her funeral. I mean, I'm telling you the etiquette. You got to go to the person's funeral. It was prohibited, so the Torah is telling you you're allowed to. Yeah, Gershon, you with me? Yeah, Zeb, you with me? Where are we holding? We're holding the bottom of Gimel Amud Aleph still. So yeah, in middle of the second to last line, it says Rabbi Akiva. So, but now we have a question. Second to last line, in the middle of the line. Rabbi Akiva, according to Rabbi Akiva, how it makes sense what Rabbi Shmuel said. The Torah is telling you you're not allowed to normally go, but we're allowing you to go. Why does Rabbi Akiva think it's a mitzvah? Why would Rabbi Akiva think that it's telling you he has to go to his virgin sister's funeral? The key, Im l'she'er nafka, he says, wait a second. He says, look at that verse itself. It says straight out, when it says, tell Kohanim not to go to the funeral, follow right along to the next verse. It says, ki im l'she'er, besides for an immediate relative. It says it straight out in the Torah. In the next verse, not the third verse, the verse we're quoting, I believe, is the third verse. The second verse says, to your mother and your father. It says to go to the thing. Nafka, lo yitama lamali, that which would then mean, as he's being consistent in his opinion and saying, the word lo yitama, why do I need it? It's extra to say that to become impure to your sister. Before it started listing this virgin sister, it spoke about the mother, the father. Over there it said, but to immediate relative, it's okay. So, and then it lists them. Then at the end of the list, it says the virgin sister, and then it says to her, you could become impure. I don't need this. To her, you could become impure. To tell me that you're allowed to, that there's license, that there's permission to go to all these people, including your virgin sister's funeral, because it already starts off the second verse after it tells me, don't go to anybody's funeral. It says kim l'shady, but to a relative, it's okay. So why does it have to end when it brings finally the sister? It says at the end, but to her, you could go to her funeral. That's extra. If it says the extra word, beautiful, it's coming to teach me an obligation that you have to go to her funeral, because it's extra word saying go to her funeral. You have to go. The Kohen's not allowed to say, maybe I want to be holy, I don't want to go to funerals. No, I'm telling you, get off your bench and go to the funeral, get off your holiness or so. I'm not just saying you're allowed to, but go to her funeral. Well, now Rabbi Shmuel has a problem, because Rabbi Shmuel said that it was telling us just giving you permission, but it says twice go to her funeral, once to tell me you're allowed to, and the second time to tell me that you have to go. So Rabbi Shmuel, Loi Mitama, very interesting. It says, I actually use it for something else. La Mitama ve'e mitama levereha. I'll first translate, then I'll explain. To her, the Kohen could go to her funeral as a complete body, but he cannot become impure to her limbs, which means the rules of impurity are that a limb, even if a Kohen, not just he's not allowed to go to a dead body, but a Kohen is not allowed to even go to a limb of a person. That gives out impurity. So a Kohen would defile himself by going to a limb. So if God forbid, the person had some kind of a sickness, we have the bus bombings in Tel Aviv, God forbid, there's stories with these things. And the Torah says he's only allowed to go, Rabbi Shmuel says there's a rule that the Kohen is only allowed to go to his whole sisters. The normal funeral, he's allowed to go to her bodies, his sister's funeral. But God forbid, if there's a parent who if there was a hand, he would become violated by going to let's say there was another second part to the funeral and they were burying limbs or something like that. He's not allowed to go to that part of the funeral where it's just limbs. He's allowed to go to the whole person funeral, but if it's kind of pieces, it conveys tumah, and that would interesting. Well, let's not get into the whys about it, because it's not our topic for today. But Rabbi Shmuel says there's a rule that the Kohen has to go to her whole, as a complete normal regular funeral can go. But if there is somehow there's limbs or something, he's not allowed to be included in that part of the funeral. So he says that word, according to Rabbi Shmuel, is not extra. When it says the virgin sister la and ends after it lists all the relatives, it says la mitama, go to her you become impure. It's telling you la, if it's a person, if it's a whole person, if it's a funeral for a person, to the person's funeral you could go. But God forbid if it's limbs or something like that. And the Kohen doesn't have permission to go to the funeral. So that word is basically not extra. According to Rabbi Shmuel, I don't agree, he says. The word is not an extra word of lo yitama. It didn't say twice that you could go to her funeral. It said once. Go to the kim the she'era. It begins telling you but a relative you could go to, and then it says, and you can only go to a funeral of a complete body, but not to part limbs. It's not saying it twice, and therefore I disagree with Rabbi Akiva, who says that it says it twice, and therefore learns out that once is to tell me that he's allowed to defile himself, and the second time it's telling me that you should go to her funeral. No, the first time it's telling me that I'm allowed to go to a funeral. The second time it's saying I'm only allowed to go to a funeral if it's law, if there's a person there, if it's a body, complete body there, I'm allowed to go, but not to limbs. Okay. But now we turn to the next page of the Amud. We're on Gimel, we're on side B, we're Gimel Amud Beis, Gimel page 3B. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Akiva. Well, now he's got a problem. Rabbi Akiva, how do you know? How are you saying that it's an obligation to go to the funeral because it said it twice? It doesn't say it twice. The second time it's going to tell me to go to the whole body funeral, not a limb. So he says, Imkain, if you wanted to argue that second time it says lo yitama, go to her funeral, it means to her limbs, like go to her body, but not to limbs. Lichtei Rachman Allah, the Torah should have just said to her, go to her. In other words, telling you go to the funeral, we're listing your relatives, and then finish and say, but if it's a person, if your sister's there, your sister's there, go. And then stop. Should have said the list of people, and if it's a person, go. La, to her go, but not to her limbs, indicating. Yitama lamali, why does it say to her? Again, if she became impure, go. Just say to her, if it's a person, go, and not to her limbs. Why does it say lo yitama to her? And again, say an extra word. If she became impure, why do we need that extra word yitama to become impure to her? Shmami, no, that extra word there teaches me not just that it's to her if she's a person, go, but if she became impure extra time, you have to go to her funeral. If she became impure, telling an extra word teaching me something extra according to Rabbi Kiva, because he learns every word, and it must be teaching me, therefore, that he must go. Shmami, no, that's what he holds. Well, Rabbi Shmuel, I got back to you now. There's an extra word. That's if it's only coming to tell me, as you wanted to argue, that it means to her as a person law, why does it have to say the word yitama that you should become impure to them? So here he goes again. He says, the same thing he's been saying. It's not symmetric, if not. And, to her who became impure, you should go. It fits into the language. Rabbi Shmuel again uses his theory that the Torah says things just to make it poetic, for poetic license, for allowing you to make things to make sense. And you say, the Torah will say an extra word. I need the cost of law. Since it's saying her, go to her as a person. Said nami yitama to her when she becomes impure. So it adds the word impure. The Kidatani, the Rabbi Shmuel, as we learned, they said from Rabbi Shmuel, the Tani, the Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel said again, same saying as before in the last case, called Parsha, any portion of Torah, any Torah section. Shenamar of Anishnish, which is said and then repeated. Loinishnish, the reason why it's repeating it, only for the thing that it originally came to identify with, to clarify. And in this case, is that you're allowed to go to a funeral, even though it says a second one later on, it's just following in suit with its original novelty that he's allowed to go to her funeral, and it might be saying an extra word. The word yitama here specifically, in this case, is just coming to tell us the original novelty, just coming to fit in, so it should be symmetric one with another, right?
What is the nishnes here, lady? What's if kol parsha shenem rav nishnes lenishnes el bishvil davar shenischadish?
Any section that's coming to tell me, what's coming to tell me here is that it's coming to tell me that you can go. The chiddush is that you were allowed to go. The Torah section here is coming to tell us one idea, that you're allowed to go to a relative's, immediate relative's funeral, even though there might be extra words in the sequence, in the way, the phraseology of the way he's speaking himself. It's all coming for the same one point, that you can go to an immediate relative's funeral. And it's not coming to add on other layers and other rules. In addition, that it's not just allowed, but it's also an obligation.
So that extra word that they add over there, yitama, right? Yitama, it's not coming to teach us anything new. It's just purely to be
poetic. It's symmetrical, correct. Law is teaching us a separate rule, that it's the body and not the other thing. But yitama is coming to teach us that it has to be to the whole person as a whole, and not to.
But it doesn't make sense, because he's, Rabbi Shmuel is still teaching something
from there. I don't know. It's a good question. Hold the thought. Great question. I'm not sure. It's a very good question. I'm not sure. I hear what you're saying. And okay, but I don't want to, let's finish. Hold the thought. We'll go back to all the questions. Great. Menashe wants to know who the halacha is like so far. Gershon wants to know, it seems like we do learn new things. I don't know. I'm not sure. Let's see if we can figure it out after we finish this one case, and then we'll wrap it up altogether. We'll wrap it up, and then we'll go back to the questions. Okay, Zakti Gemara goes on. Third and final case for today. Slaves. There's a debate. Rabbi Kiva Omer, you should really always keep them and work them. They become your possession. When you have a Gentile servant, okay, today we don't have slaves, but in those days when there was slavery, you should keep them and pass them on to your children. Rishus, Rabbi Shmuel, it's telling you you're allowed to keep them. That's what Rabbi Shmuel says. It's not telling you have to. Rabbi Kiva says that it is a chayva, it is a obligation, it's a must, that you're violating. Rabbi Kiva wants to say you're violating it if you let them go. My time, but what's the reason? Why do they argue? Why does Rabbi Shmuel say when the Torah tells you to do something, you have to do it? Why does Rabbi Shmuel say it's only permission? So Rabbi Shmuel says, I did deceive, since it says, as we learned in our Navi class that we had, you're not allowed to let any soul live when you go to Eretz Yisrael, right? The way I explained it there is that Hashem, when he sent the Jews to Israel, he waited till they sinned enough that they had to get capital punishment. And the Jews had to enter Israel by wiping out everybody that lived there. So it should be a violation. You're not allowed to let them live. whatever. We're not getting into this whole topic now, but that's just in short. So it would be a prohibition for you to keep them as slaves because you have actually an obligation for capital punishment to wipe them out. It's that's why it needs to tell us another verse that you should work them. The Mishri to allow you the Mishri to allow you to keep them. Now it's more detailed than that. Let me explain. You're actually not allowed to keep in all cases. It's very interesting Gemara here telling you that Judaism, we always go by the mother, but Judaism recognizes by a Gentile that it goes by the father. So that's what he's telling you. Which servant could you keep? And you don't have to do what the Torah says to wipe them out, is if it was a child born from a Canaanite mother. Right? Canaanite, we learned that the Navi represents all the 7 nations are called Canaanites because they were the most powerful nation. We learned in our Navi class. So he says, the Mishri Echad Mikol Ha'umois, to allow one of all the nations. It means a male of other nations, not of the 7 nations, not of the Canaanite nation. Shabal Aknan is that had a child together with a Canaanite woman, v'hoilid mimena bein, and gave birth to a son. That son you're allowed to purchase, you're allowed to buy, right? So in other words, again, back to Rabbi Shmuel's point, I would think that any Canaanite, whether it be a father or a mother, it's prohibited for you to purchase the son and to keep him as a slave because the Torah told you the Canaanite people, you have to wipe them out. So he says, no. Anyone that, if it's a mother Canaanite, the Torah that had a child with a non-Canaanite husband, not someone that lived in Canaan, you are allowed to actually purchase, and they're selling them as a slave as they would do in those days, you're allowed to purchase them as a slave. Now he's going to discuss for a moment where we know that it follows the father, not the mother, which is a separate side topic, but we need to just talk about this part of the Tanya, like we learned in the Brisa, so like another, again, say, of the Brisa, the origins of the oral tradition passed down. Menayin, how do we know? That one of the nations, Shabal Aknanis, that came on a Canaanite woman, and had a son with the Canaanite woman, that there's permission, license for you to buy that child as a slave and not have to fulfill the commandment by Hashem to wipe out the nations of Israel at the time. That's why it says, and here's a very interesting thing, I'm just going to explain to you for a minute to understand the verse. What it says is that the custom was in those days, just like myself, I moved to my wife's hometown, that the husband would move for a while at least, to the area where his wife lived, at least in the beginning, I guess, of their life. The husband would move to where the wife was. So if we said, so basically, if it was a Canaanite woman who married a guy that came from out of town, but he came to be with his wife, to live with his in-laws, to live with his wife in the land of Canaan, and therefore she was a local and her child was born from a local, but it's not a problem because the local women, it's okay to have their child as long as the husband's from out of town. So Talmud Leimer, it says, even from the locals, Hagarim Itchem, who live among you, Mehem Tiknu, you could purchase them. And I thought the Torah though said that you have to kill all the locals. So I would think that slavery will be allowed from anyone, even a male Canaanite. That had a child together with a woman from out of town. And had a child with as long as any one of the partners was from out of Israel, out of Canaan, that you could buy him as a slave. So the Torah is telling you, no, you can't buy anyone. It's specifically someone, the verse says, that were born in your land, meaning, what does it mean the child was born at home? Not from the original settlers, that his father was an original settler in the land of Israel, which was commanded those men have to be wiped out and their descendants. We're talking about someone that his father came to live for a while in Israel, meaning he wasn't out of town or he wasn't a local, and he ended up marrying a local girl, and they had a child there. So it's telling us that you're allowed to have them as a slave. So that's the detail. So the Torah says, but the bottom line is that Rabbi Shmuel is saying, I would have thought you're not allowed to own anybody from Israel, but there is a permission, there is a case where the Torah is going to allow you that if it's born in Israel because they came from out of town to live with their wife in Israel, because it's a Canaanite mother, it's okay to own their children. And therefore it's telling you permission, license is given, and not that you have to keep them as a slave, but the fact I would have thought you're not allowed to own them as a slave, and therefore it's telling you that you're allowed to own them as a slave. Very interesting. So now we got to go back to conclude with Rabbi Akiva. We have to conclude with Rabbi Akiva. Well, it seems from here that it makes sense what Rabbi Shmuel said, that it was giving you permission, because I would have thought it's not allowed, because you have to kill everybody in Canaan, and telling you that you're allowed in the right case, you're allowed to keep them as a slave. So it's just telling you you're allowed to, not telling you have to. So Rabbi Akiva, what does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva holds you have to. Mehem tiknu nafki. He says, listen, it says first the words mehem tiknu. The Torah says in those sequence of verses there is that you should buy them, children of mothers who are Canaanite, you should buy them. It says already nafka, we learn it out. We tell us clearly that you could buy them. And the words are extra. That you should keep them forever as slaves is extra. That's not part of telling you that you're allowed to buy them. It already says you're allowed to buy them. Why does it say the extra words that forever with them you should work? Not give them up, not give them away, keep them to your children and pass it on as inheritance. Lamali, why is it for me? L'chayva, to tell me that you're obligated, l'chayva, that you are obligated to keep them, and it's prohibition according to Rabbi Akiva to give up your rights to them as a slave. Well, we have two times now. So what is Rabbi Shmuel going to say? Rabbi Akiva says it twice. Rabbi Shmuel, behem, and Rabbi Shmuel says, what does he do with the words behem? La'ilam behem tavaidu, to teach me something else. Behem v'loi ba'acheichem, with them and not their brothers, to teach me something completely different. What's the case? It's another law that you're allowed to do with non-Jewish slaves, but you're not allowed to do with Jewish slaves, right? The Torah is very strict about all slaves. By the way, if you hurt a non-Jewish slave, you have to let him knock out his tooth. You have to let him go free. The Torah, by the way, the Torah protected the rights of slavery because everyone had slaves, and the Torah limited the rules. But the Torah was more strict in certain things by non-Jewish slave, and more strict in a sense with Jewish slaves. Certain things, depending on whatever Hashem's wisdom decided it should be. So the Torah says there's certain rules. A slave normally was not a job that you would hire a guy. A non-Jewish slave was a real thing as was slavery in the olden days. You had to do whatever you told him to do. You got up in the morning, told him what to do. Jewish slaves very certain requirements is that you have to tell him what the job is, why he needs to do it. It has to be purposeful. You also have to tell him how long. This is how long the job's going to take, whatever, so on. And this is what you have to do. This is the reason why I need it done. And this is how long it's going to take. Non-Jewish slave, you don't have that kind. There's other requirements, but not that kind of requirement. Basically treat him, I get, maybe it's because you have to treat him in a sense like a hired worker, not like a slave, basically. You can't hire a Jew as a slave. It would made limits on how Jewish slavery could be done. So he says, so Rabbi Shmuel says, you want to know why it says, the extra words with them keep forever. It's telling me something else. This rule that I just mentioned, that a Jewish slave, with them, you have to work in a kind way, in a way of like a normal, regular worker. I'm sorry, with a non-Jewish slave, you can work them as a regular slave, which means just tell them what you want to do. You don't have to tell them why and so on. But not by your brothers. By your brothers, you have to tell them why and for how long and so on. It's teaching me that rule, a different rule. That's why the Torah says two different things. One is to tell me that you're allowed to purchase them as slaves, non-Jewish slaves, because they're sons of a mother who was a Canaanite woman. And the second verse is coming to tell me something else. Tell me that you only them could you treat in a servant kind of way, but their brothers, Jewish servants, cannot be treated in that kind of way. Well, now, so that's what Rabbi Shmuel explained it. It's not two times it's superfluous to tell me you have to do it. So we need both. We need the second time to teach me this other rule. So now we're back to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, what is Rabbi Akiva going to do? He's telling me the second time was superfluous, and therefore it's to tell me that you must keep them. He learns it out from a later part of the verse. We're almost done, guys. It says, your brothers, the Jewish people, ish ba'achiv, a man with his brother, you should not overwork him. And that context of that verse is teaching me that the requirements and the rights of a Jewish slave are more than a non-Jewish slave, and you have to teach him in this way. And from the words achechem, from that extra word there, it's teaching us that, as I mentioned, certain requirements of letting him know how much time and letting him know the reason, whatever someone is learned from later on, and therefore the extra words that Rabbi Akiva said I mentioned are really extra, and therefore it's telling me, the extra words are telling me, because every word is learned according to Rabbi Akiva, is telling me that you must keep them as a slave. Rabbi Shmuel. So what is Rabbi Shmuel going to do now with that extra word? Because Rabbi Akiva proved how it's extra. And then he's going to finish, since it says your brothers, it says already the word bahem with them, which you thought was extra. Look at the Tani, as we learned, the name of Rabbi Shmuel. Tani, the very Rabbi Shmuel, the school of Rabbi Shmuel taught, Parsha, Shenamar of Inishnis, any Torah portion which was taught and then repeated, the Inishnis, the reason it's repeating itself, Ella, Ishvil Davish and Chadash was only coming to teach us the novelty that it originally came out to teach, and not for anything extra or new that it came out to teach. I'm going to end the recording over here, and I think this is a beautiful Gemara, fascinating Gemara, showing us the insights behind some of the ideas here, to teach us about the way Gemara is learned, is that Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Akiva are arguing throughout 3 cases of the Talmud, but it's really debate, and the debate is how we learn that extra word. And that is the end. We're going to conclude. We'll have a discussion now on it, on some of the questions that we brought up, very interesting questions, but that is the end of our recording.